Whereas his time in Central Christian Church, John has held just about every position of leadership imaginable in his church. Many of them more than once. One other thing I would like to relate about John is that he and Rich Cowden will soon become in-laws as Rich's daughter Casey will be marrying John's grandson, John Albright. So it's my pleasure to introduce John Bridwell.
Well, I've got all my tools right here. I've got the cane and my walker right here behind me. So I'll be prepared if I collapse or whatever before. I don't know whether I can really stand long enough to say whatever it is I'm going to say, but we'll see. Well, I won't start. I feel a little bit more comfortable. One little funny story about standing up. One of my grandsons got married here at Central Christian Church about 2 years ago, and they invited me to say a prayer during the wedding, or at the beginning of the wedding. And I thought, well, it's no big deal. I'll have the pulpit or the lectern or something to hold on to. And when I got to the church the day of the wedding, I can't remember the lady's name that was performing the service, but anyway, she said, well, we've made it easy for you to stand because we're going to give you a microphone and you can stand right here at the foot of the stairs in the sanctuary and give the prayer. You would think that would be a good idea. But so I got up to give the prayer, and about halfway through, I could feel myself rocking back and forth. And one of my granddaughters, who's a physical therapist, was almost ready to jump up and grab me. So I opened my eyes, as Brandon had us do this morning, and I recovered. I didn't fall, but anyway, I like to have something to hold on to. Also, one other comment I'd like to make before we start is that I had been asked to do this before, and so most of the notes I have were prepared some time ago. Now, nothing much exciting has happened in the last year or so anyway, but Sunday, if those of you that were in the sanctuary for our 11 o'clock service, the men's breakfast was mentioned at the end, that we were going to have it, and I was going to be the speaker. And Reverend Brandon, in mentioning this, said something like, maybe 1/3 or only 2/3 of what I was going to say would be the truth, or something like that. So this past week, I've been reading through my notes to wipe out. I've cut this talk down from 30 minutes to 20 minutes because I took out all the stuff that wasn't true. Just a point of reference, how many people in here were born before 1939? 1. 2? Well, and how many were born before 1945? Well, okay, that gives me a lot of leeway to say about my childhood because nobody else, or there's very few people that repeat what I have to say. 49?
39.
Oh, before 39. Well, for those of you that know me a little bit, I was born and raised in Frankfurt. And I was also born into the Disciples of Christ Christian Church. I have been a member in the Christian Church since I was 12 years old. I went through, it's pretty common in those days that when you got to be 12 years old, that was the age of consent, I guess, for joining the church. And so Bob Stauffer's father was the pastor at Frankfurt First Christian, and he baptized me when I was 12. And you don't hold it against him if you hear things that make you wonder about me. When I was 3 years old, my parents died. My father, you know, back in those days, well, at 3 years old, I doubt if many of you remember anything about what happened to you when you were 3. But my father killed himself 4 days before my 3rd birthday. Of course, I didn't know that until I was about 12. And I was walking down the street near my house, and there was a fellow painting on the house. I didn't know him, but he seemed to know who I was. He called me by name, and we started talking, and he said something about my father committing suicide. And that was the first time I'd ever heard. I knew that, you know, my father had died when I was 3, but I had no idea. And nobody in my family ever talked about it for the rest of their lives. My father and mother were both only children, so I didn't have any aunts and uncles. Then, unfortunately, I don't want y'all to feel sorry for me, but unfortunately, before that year was over, my mother died in a car wreck just outside of Frankfurt. You know, there was some discussion about whether she was killed in the wreck or whether she maybe had a brain aneurysm or something. In those days, 1941, you know, the medical profession was not as, I guess, able to sometimes tell what happened. And so anyway, the story in the paper was a bee got in the car and she hit a tree. But my cousin who was with her said, well, I don't know whether that's what happened or not. You know, maybe a bee got in the car, because my cousin was not even injured. And so, who knows? I don't know. But anyway, that's how my life started. But fortunately, I don't remember any of that. I felt like my family, I was raised by my maternal grandmother, and for some of the good points that I have in my life, I owe it to her more than anybody else, because she was a dedicated church member. We went to, like I say, First Christian Church. We went every Sunday. I participated in all the activities that the children were supposed to, except a couple. Choir. When I was in the 4th grade, my music teacher in the Frankfurt City Schools wanted to have a PTA program, and the 4th grade kids were going to sing. And so we practiced the afternoon after school before the PTA meeting. And at the end of that session, she called me over and she says, and she was a distant cousin of my family. Anyway, she said, now John Clinton, when we sing tonight, you just move your lips.
Bar 5.
That ended my music career, and I've never recovered from that. I do like to sing in church, but of course, the organ pretty well drowns out what I sing. Anyway, my grandmother had a practice of praying and reading the upper room nearly every night, and she did that for me, and it included me and my sister in that, and that helped me have a practice of some prayer time and devotional time to myself nearly every day. Now, you know, being a typical college student, I kind of wandered away from that practice for a while, but I have reestablish that. Fortunately, you know, I grew up at a time when not only family was close, but also neighborhoods were close. And I feel like for those of you that, and people in this room don't have much experience with the World War II, but of course I grew up, the first part of my time was when World War II was going on, but I didn't, you know, I didn't have any family that was involved in the war. Everybody was too old. So it was a nice, quiet time to grow up, and it's a relatively small town. Nobody, you know, seemed to be scared of anything. We hardly ever locked our doors. If one of the kids did something, I can remember being one that did. I got mad, and we were playing basketball in a friend's backyard, and I got mad about something, or whether I was not a very good player, but I got mad and I threw the ball, not at somebody, but I don't know where I threw it. But that boy's father came down and took me aside and he said something to the fact, you know, that's not the way you're supposed to play. So that was an example of, you know, we wandered through other people's neighborhoods. As I became a teenager, you know, we would wander off to go hiking or playing on the railroad tracks or who knows what. And my grandmother never seemed to worry about where I was or what I was up to. One other bad thing I remember us doing, there was a abandoned whiskey warehouse about 2 blocks from where we lived. And it was a wonderful place to go down and break windows. Oh well, you know. It was also a great time to, and somehow or another, riding the train. My family, we occasionally go to Louisville. Nobody in family drove a car, so we got on the train in those days to ride to Louisville. My grandfather we could ride the train from up here to Lexington, get off down there where Main Street Christian Church used to be, but it was, you know, it was the train depot, walk over the bridge, watch the football game, come back, get on the train, go back to Frankfurt. The only thing I remember besides riding the train is that we came to see that one football game where UK beat, I don't know whether it was South Dakota or South Dakota State, like something like 80-0. I think that was the highest scoring game that UK had ever played in. But anyway, that was just an example of the good times that I feel like, in spite of, you know, not having parents, you know, I had a wonderful environment in which to grow up. The next thing I'd like to mention is that I also we had a good school system. And it was a time too that, you know, parents didn't seem to be worried about what was going on in school. In the sense that I don't remember parents, you know, coming to PTA or something in private and complaining about something, or parents attacking the students, I mean not the students, but the teachers. But anyway, my main point is that we had a good school system in Frankfurt. And I found that out when I went to college. Because in most of the classes, especially the first 2 years, I mean, I felt like I knew just about everything that was being taught in those days, because there were so many kids that their high school education had not been very good, and there was a lot of remedial classwork that took place in those days. But fortunately for me, my education was pretty good. Now, my athletic participation during high school did not measure up to my education requirements. I played 2 years of basketball and 1 year of baseball. Later in life, at a retirement party, one of the players that played on the same team that I did, he was probably, if not 3 sheets to the wind, at least 2 sheets to the wind. And when I went to congratulate him on his retirement, and he said, "John, I remember when we played basketball together, you were just about the worst player that we ever had in Frankfort High School." So anyway, so I had to take the part out of my presentation about my athletic prowess after Brandon's comments. I'm gonna confess right here up front that it wasn't anything to write home about. I did come to UK in 1955, where I studied civil engineering, as Tim mentioned. For some reason, that's what I'd always dreamed of doing. Now, if you ask me what civil engineers did when I went to college, I would probably say build roads, railroads, and that was the limit of my knowledge. So I learned that there was a lot of other things involved. But during my school time at university, I met a fellow. They had a group of disciples, like a disciple student fellowship. I think a lot of that is abandoned. But Dave Wallace here on the front row, he's one that would remember, when we raised our hands about 39, Dave raised his hands. So he's in my age group, and we knew each other here at Central, even though he went to Transylvania and I was at the University of Kentucky. So anyway, during that time, I began to think, well, maybe civil engineering is not what I ought to be in. That maybe I ought to be something, do some church work or be involved. And I contemplated actually going into the ministry. And I've always worried that, well, did I abandon the call because I wanted to be an engineer? I went so far as to take some classes in philosophy, and I decided, I hate to do that. The reason I was in civil engineering or into engineering was I was pretty good with numbers, but I was not very good at socializing and getting along with people. So I thought, well, that what I'm getting ready to do sort of fits my personality. I can just bury myself in numbers and not have to worry about other people to work with. But of course, later in life, I found out that wasn't true. That's not how the world works. But after some thought, I don't know whether I made a mistake, but I didn't change courses from where I was, and I graduated in civil engineering in '59, and actually got a master's degree in '62. At that time, I had to go to school. I had gotten a scholarship, and one of the features of the scholarship required me to go back and work for state government in Frankfurt or somewhere. And so, at the end of my education, I ended up going to work for the State Highway Department in Frankfurt. Now, one of the good things about going to graduate school, which again, my thought process about going to graduate school, I can't say was based on my thirst for future knowledge. When I was a senior in school, the word floated around, if you would get it, if you stay in school and get an advanced degree, you could get a deferment and not have to be drafted. this was when we still had mandatory draft. So I said, well, that sounds like a pretty good deal. I wanted to get married, and I did not particularly want to go into the Army. I had 2 years of ROTC, and I thought, I don't know whether this is something I really want to do. And in 1959, when I graduated, fortunately, the United States was not actively involved in any military actions. So there wasn't a real cry for more people to enlist. So after I signed up to go to graduate school, I did get called up for a pre-draft physical. I don't know what that really meant. So I thought, here I've signed up to go to school, and I may have to go in the military anyway. So I went down I had to go to Louisville, and I went through the physical, which it was sort of like most people imagine when they join the Army. It probably wasn't quite that intense. But at the end, within a couple of days, I got a letter saying that they didn't want me anyway. I have bad feet, and in those days, flat feet will eliminate you from being in the military. So anyway, I went ahead and took advantage of my thirst, or a lack of thirst, to get a degree in civil engineering. My career, one other thing I want to mention, one of the advantages of going to graduate school was the university got its first computer system. I can't remember the date, maybe about 1960, when I was in graduate school. And so, it was one that took up a whole room full, and air conditioning that was really intense. So, as part of my graduate studies, I took a class. It wasn't required, but I took a class in computer science, or whatever they called it in those days. And I thought, this makes a lot of sense. Here I've spent 5 or 6 years learning how to do all these calculations, and it seems like, with a lot of that stuff could be computerized. And I actually used that when I wrote my master's thesis, which was required in those days. I think now maybe it's, a thesis is not required so much, it's just more classwork, which I probably would have done if that had been an opportunity. So when I went to work for the State Highway Department, I got a job in the beginning of the computer science and how we might apply it in our work. That was probably a great. It kind of changed my career path from just being it's probably a bad word, from designing bridges, which is where I first went to work, to actually figuring out how we might be able to use this primitive tool. It's probably hard to imagine, the computer that took up a whole room, and with all that, was probably not any more powerful than a phone. And another story is, of course, after all this time I spent working with computers, now, if something happens, I have to call my grandson. who has no college education to come over and fix it. And if he can't fix it, then I have to call my granddaughter, who's, well, now she's 20, but, at 16 or 17, she knew more about how to fix my computer and my phone than I did. Well, which brings me up to, I guess, the end of my time. I don't know whether my 20 minutes is up or not, but my one engineering feat was, for those of you that know, the bridge over the Ohio River in Cincinnati. Now, I didn't design the bridge, but Brent Spence Bridge, yes. But I did design some of the approach work on the Covington side to get on the bridge. That was probably the biggest project I ever worked, where I actually worked on a project that something happened that like it really got built. I did have, my computer interest led me to actually do a little teaching on the side. When BCTC here in Lexington was originally part of the UK, somebody over there found out that I was working in computing in Frankfurt and invited me to teach some night classes. Now I mention this only because, not because I was a great instructor, but one summer they asked if I would teach a class to people out at the federal prison, you know, out here on the Leestown Pike. And I said, yeah, okay, I'll give it a shot. And it was kind of an interesting, one of the most interesting thing was the caliber of people that took the class was pretty good. I was really surprised. You know, they, for the most part, they seemed to be really interested in learning what computers were all about. Anyway, during the summer, and I don't know if you know, I don't know too much about what the well, I want to say what the people out there were in for, that's what. So I suggested to somebody out there that had control over the classic, I said I would like to take some of these folks over to the UK and let them see what a computer system is all about. And so I asked if that was, I asked the class if they were interested in going, and nearly everybody raised their hand. Well, when the day came for us to go, only 4 or 5 of them were able to go because some of the, I don't know whether they broke rules or whether they decided they didn't want to go, but that was the problem. And we went to UK, we took a tour, but the main interest of those people were that after the tour was over, we stopped at McDonald's and I bought lunch for us. And I think that was the highlight of the whole fair. I think they were so thirsty for an outside hamburger. Well, so much for my computing experience. I did a lot. I did that at over here at BCTC, and also did at Kentucky State for several years. Kentucky State had a program where they were in partner with the Kentucky Highway Department and UK and U of L, that you could go to Kentucky State and for 3 years and get all your basic courses and then transfer to engineering school at either U of L or UK. So I had the opportunity to teach students that were headed in the same direction that I had gone. Well, finally, and I guess that's everybody likes to hear that word. I will mention, Tim mentioned some of the things I've done here at Central Christian Church. You know, one of the things that I told myself since I had that experience about whether I should maybe go into full-time church work or continue with my engineering was that I thought I was going to be try to be a good layperson. As he mentioned, I did have the opportunity to serve here at Central as chair of the board and as moderator, 2 or 3 terms as treasurer. All of this was in the 90s. Those of you that remember, Bill Paulsell was elected to be chair of the board, and I don't remember exactly what year that was. Well, 2 or 3 months after he was elected, he got a call to be minister of a church up in, I think up in Indiana somewhere. And all of a sudden, the chair of the board was leaving. And the word I got that the vice chair wasn't interested in moving up. So for some reason, somebody just asked me if I would take over being chair of the board. Well, and without giving it as much thought maybe about what it might mean, I said, yeah, I'll do it. I'll be glad to do it. Well, it turns out that within a year, the senior minister was retiring. And before he retired, our minister of music resigned all of a sudden. And so all of a sudden, we were faced with trying to replace the minister of music and prepare for the leaving of the senior minister. The senior minister had not officially retired, but for those of you that remember, it was Glenn Burke. But nearly all of us knew that he was going to retire about the time he turned 65 or something in that age. So we were kind of thinking that was going to happen. Well, when we tried to hire a minister of music, we didn't hire anybody because, as it turned out, once we made the selection, you know, they didn't ask me to sing during during the interview. And the fellow that we had asked declined because he had heard that there was going to be a change in the senior minister, and he didn't think that he wanted to come with that facing that change. So that's when we asked Michael Renneman if he would come and fill in while over some period of time while we were getting a new senior minister and getting a new minister of music. Well, of course, you know the story about Michael Renneman is the choir was really enthusiastic after he'd been here a little while. And so even though we had told Michael that he couldn't be a candidate for being the minister for our music program, it turns out that we said, yes, we'll keep him. And then, of course, the senior minister did retire, and so we had a search committee. We brought in Michael Moody. Then it was shortly. Then I quit being the chair of the board, but then I was chair of the congregation, and who is also, that probably doesn't have as much influence. But during that period of time, we had to replace the business administrator, and shortly after that, the minister for education. And anyway, so we had a lot of turnover of staff during that time that I was serving. I can't believe that when I took a test in school, or at the end of my high school career, I took some kind of aptitude test. And one of the things they said I should not be was an accountant or any kind of writer, and which was probably true. However, in spite of that, the central asked me to be treasurer for 2 terms, and unfortunately, I didn't have to do any accounting. I guess in closing, I would also like to say that I met my wife here at Central Christian Church in 1956, I believe it was, and we got married here in 1959. We raised 3 children in this church, as Tim mentioned, all three of them turned out to be civil engineers, but two of them are active here at Central Christian Church, and the other, my third daughter, who most people think, do you have a third daughter? Because nobody here ever sees her, but she goes to the First Christian Church down in Bridwell, and she served there as chair of the board herself. Unfortunately, most of you, or many of you may know, my wife passed away about a year ago. And, you know, for those of us that are married, have been married, want to be married, you know, having a partner is a tremendous asset. And my wife, unfortunately, she and I agreed on a lot of things. And of course, we didn't agree on everything. I mean, it was okay for her to disagree with me, but it wasn't exactly the same as when I disagreed with her. but in spite of all of that,
Amen to that.
we were married for 65 years minus 4 days. Yeah, originally when David first asked me to make a presentation, which seems like 2 or 3 years ago, he sent me a list of the 3 questions that I think what David Shirey had asked us to talk about, and I don't know I've talked about any of that. But they said, who is the man that has most influence on your life? And I had to name 3. Again, a lot of people had named their father or my grandfather on my father's side was an influence. Both my grandfather on both sides of my family were deacons. My father's father was a deacon at the Baptist church, and my grandfather on my mother's side was a deacon at the First Christian Church. One of the things that always bothered me a little bit, when we went to church with my grandparents that were Baptists, and we went on Communion Sunday, but they didn't have communion. I think they had it once a month. But my grandparents, you know, never asked me to let me, or invited us to participate. My sister and I, who had both been members of the church, never asked, you know, for us that it was okay to receive communion at their church. But anyway, my grandfather, Bridwell, did have a good bit, some influence on my life. My next door neighbor had some practical influence on my life. He was a carpenter at a distillery in Frankfurt. His name was Tilden Lanner, and he would help my grandmother out after my grandfather passed away. And he took me under his wing and showed me how to do certain things with tools. And we, you know, those were the days before you had power saws and drills, power drills, and all those kind of things. You know, he did things the hard way, but he showed me how to do things, repair things, and I've always been thankful for that. Ironically, his 2 granddaughters came to work for me in what I'll just call, for lack of a better term, the computer department in state government some 20 or 30, 25 years later. I thought that was an interesting side fact. And also a fellow that taught at the seminary by the name of Newton Big Fowler, who at the time he was the minister to students on the disciples on the UK campus, and he and his wife had a good influence on my wife and I. We participated actively in that group, and also one here at Central. And he came back to the seminary, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago, and we got to rekindle a friendship there. And let's see, oh, and in the working relationship, for whatever reason, well, the first place I worked in the Highway Department's Division of Bridges, the assistant director, who was a Frankfurt guy, seemed to take a liking to me. And I know he could be real irritating with a lot of people. He never was, you know, he never seemed to have a cross word or say anything. But he paved the way for a lot of advances in the highway department. And fortunately, for me, I was able to some extent follow on his coattail. And he helped me with my career and the transition from being a full-time design engineer to, again, I don't know what you might call it. People that work in computers have always struggled to know what we call ourselves. And whatever it was at the time, he helped me make the transition. And then when I think a little bit about what's going on in the federal government right now, something similar to that happened in state government about 1980. And all of a sudden, I was no longer an engineer in the transportation cabinet, but now I was a computer manager of some description in the newly created computer department. And that's where I ended up finishing my career. So, I appreciate you all staying for the whole presentation. And I surely hope that you'll be back again next month. I will not be repeating this talk. Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
I want you to elaborate. You said your athletic career was sort of a dud, but
Yes.
your last little bit of athletic career happened to be on the Central softball team, and we won the city championship.
Well, yes, and I should have mentioned that because Tim said he came to Lexington in '79. I didn't realize I'd still be playing softball in 1979 because I was 40 years old then. Lord have mercy. I don't think the Lord was carrying me through those years, but yes, I did forget that.
And I remember he was a pretty good first baseman.
Yes, he was.
And he had this unique batting stance, kind of an inside-out swing to dump it in the opposite field. And I remember his daughter sitting in the stand shouting, "Don't get hurt, Daddy." Thank you so much.